Okay, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here today. We definitely appreciate you taking the time to participate in today's virtual training. So this is all week long. We are live from November 29th through December 3rd, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, and 11 a.m. Pacific. So with that being said, we are meeting at the same time each day, 2 p.m. Eastern. I would recommend that I'm letting everyone in usually about 10, 15 minutes in before, just so that you can all get acclimated, adjusted, and so on and so forth to the platform. Try your best to be on time because Cheryl has quite a bit of materials. And so for those of you that were early, we do appreciate you getting in here early. And for those that were on time, thank you very much. All right. So my right hand is not here today. she has the day off. But that's okay. I'm here. I'm Crystal Cedino, the Training Development Manager for the Native Learning Center. Cora will be here tomorrow. So Cora is our Training Development Specialist. She's my right hand. She's fantastic. So yes, so just anticipate to see her lovely face there tomorrow. All right, and then just a quick disclaimer, I just wanted to throw this out here. I know it says this webinar, but this training provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The materials discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that can be applicable. So just please keep that in mind. I understand we all come from certain backgrounds and so on and so forth. If you have questions, that's what these trainings are for. So please submit them into the chat box. We are here to try and help you as best as possible. Now, with this training, we usually do encourage cameras being on. However, if you are having sound issues or connection issues, please feel free to keep your camera off and just, sit through the web or the training in the background. That's totally okay. I understand, we're talking about Indian country, and internet connection in Indian country is not always the best. So feel free to, do what works best for you in this situation. If you continue to have problems, my recommendation is definitely going to be that you leave the room and then come back. I can't do much about broadband, so do keep that in mind that, with all these participants and so on and so forth, it does pull a lot of bandwidth. I will do my best to help you as best as possible, but please be patient with me as I try and troubleshoot and work through, all the issues that you might be experiencing in the session. Okay. So with that, you have quite a few options as far as how to participate. So if you're viewing today's session via the web browser of Microsoft Teams, all of your options and features are going to be towards the bottom of your screen. So if you hover your mouse towards the bottom of the Microsoft Teams screen, you should be able to see your camera option, microphone option. I believe sharing is going to be grayed out for all of you. And then you have 3 dots, and then the chat box, which is that little icon right there. And then to the right of that is going to be how you see participants. If you have microphone access, which all of you should, but for whatever reason, if it's just not working for you, use the chat box. Otherwise, I recommend that you do, start a conversation with us as far as those questions goes when there's time to, go ahead and interject. Other than that, if you're not comfortable doing that, I will be keeping my eye out on the chat box. So I will be sure to ask and keep track of all the questions that do get submitted in there. I will do my best to not miss anything. We are usually pretty good about that. Alrighty. So again, these are just the features. If you select that 3 dots, you can arrange your audio settings or device settings. You can go into full screen mode. You can start video with blur, so you can put like a background so that you can't really see anything, and then you can also turn on closed captions and so on and so forth. This is going to be the agenda. This is well, tentative agenda, as I should say, but with that, these are basically the topics that Cheryl is going to be covering in each session, just so that all of you have a better idea of what you should expect. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Cheryl. Did you? Or are you good?
That wasn't me.
Okay. All right. And just friendly reminder again, please keep yourselves muted unless like, you know, you have a question or there's an issue or something. It just helps with connectivity and less interruptions as Cheryl is presenting. So with that being said, the materials are on. I emailed all of you. If you did not receive my email, go ahead and let me know in the chat box. I will be sure to either send it to you via email or, you know, throwing it in there. And from there, you should be able to open up the web page and then download all materials. Up there we have, and I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and share that web page so that all of you can see. If you've attended any of our other sessions, it should be pretty similar to what all of you, there we go, saw at internal control, creating your own internal controls workshop. So there's procurement day 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, all the appendix items. Cheryl graciously provided an appendix items list, so all of you know exactly how all of it should come together. But we've labeled them pretty simply, so all you have to do is click that item and it automatically downloads onto your computer. So we made it easy peasy. It's all in one place. It's not going down anytime soon. Just please be cautious when sharing, you know, the link, just out of respect for materials and, you know, all of that good stuff. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and quit jibber jabbering. And I'm going to pass it off to Cheryl to go ahead and get the ball rolling. And that's all I can think of. All right, Cheryl, take it on over.
Okay. So can you see it?
I can.
All right. Welcome to day 1. I already sent up my smokes and my prayer. Good morning or good afternoon to you all. This is my information. It's you'll find it at the beginning and the end of every presentation. This is brought to you courtesy of the Native Learning Center. We are being recorded. Hopefully, if you get a chance, put your organization name and little bit about yourself in the chat box so we can look at it later. Link the time you've been involved in housing, and if you have any questions that you came to learn about. My name is Cheryl. My Anishinaabe name is Redbird Woman. I am Loon Clan. I come from Place of the Pike, which is Bay Mills Reservation. We're located at the top of Michigan and our waters border Canada. We are Ojibwe, Chippewa people, and I was the director of housing for my tribe for 28 years. I was honored to serve as the chairwoman of the National American Indian Housing Council for 4 years. Prior to that, I was on the board of directors as the vice chair and the secretary for an additional 12 years. I also served as the chairwoman for the Great Lakes Indian Housing Association for an additional 7 years when I wasn't sitting in a board seat at NIHC. So I've got a pretty good background in Indian housing. As you can tell, we've got probably 1.5 feet of snow already where I live, so I'm getting ready to run for Florida as soon as possible. Our course structure will be presentations. There's a couple exercises, not too many. There's lots of participant materials, examples, and references. So the objectives is to hopefully assist you as an NAHASDA recipient to effectively and efficiently conduct your housing procurement, to be able to comply with the requirements imposed by HUD, and all the requirements that the uniform requirements at 2 CFR Part 200 and other funding sources. After completing the training, hopefully you'll have an understanding, a little bit better understanding of the IHA management and operations in relationship to procurement. An increased knowledge of concepts and basics of procurement, and improved capabilities and proficiency of job skills and the performance of procurement functions of your housing entity. So it'll cover the administrative requirements that pertain to procurement using the Indian Housing Block Grant and EIHBG funds that are distributed to our tribes and tribal housing programs through NAHASDA. And during the course, students will learn how to conduct procurement efficiently, hopefully, and effectively, and to comply with the requirements that are imposed by HUD and our other funding sources. So we're going to discuss the skills required to perform the responsibilities related to sound procurement, management, the methods of complying again with that 2 CFR 200. And we're going to provide various procurement documents to help your organization to become, make sure you have compliance in several procurement areas. So if you could put your questions, jot them down. During the presentation, we're going to have a question and answer period at the end. I don't usually watch the chat. Crystal will be doing that on my behalf. Otherwise, I'd be far too distracted and this would take forever. So this is what our schedule looks like for the week. There's a lot of material in here. We should be able to run through it rather efficiently. So today we're going to hit understanding Indian country procurement. Today by far is the easiest day. Some of the procurement regulations. We're going to talk about that CFR 200, which is your Uniform Administration Act. We're going to talk about procurement authority, contracting officers, signature, and the obligation of funds, things that you have to make sure you kind of have in place. So I supplied, like she said, through that link, an awful lot of material. Now, these first three things within your appendix is your ECFR Part 200. That is the procurement book. Anything to do with procurement is usually related, 80% of it in this book, for your housing entity, including your audits and things like this. I would suggest you download it and put it on your computer. And if you can kill a tree and not offend anybody, I keep mine bound. Very, very helpful because oftentimes, and you're going to see when things are going to get referred to on a continual basis. Now, the next two is the NAHASDA statute and the Part 1000 regulations. Those are both within this small book here. Definitely, I would print these ones. They'll be very, very helpful for you the rest of your career. I've always tried to have those right by me, and it's a lot easier to have them bound like that because oftentimes a regulation will refer to 7 or it'll cite 7 or 8 different things that you need to check, and it's faster to do it that way. We've got quite a bit on Indian preference determination letters, qualification applications. So this is part of the listing, as you can see, of all the forms that are in there. There's example ethics policies, a sample procurement policy, telephone solicitations, 29 basic items in there for you guys to use. So hopefully they'll be very, very helpful to you. So when you go to understand Indian country procurement, we're a lot different than other places. And procurement basically is the buying of goods or services. HUD procurement requirements that accompany NAHASDA are found within that 24 CFR Part 1000 that I was talking about, 2 CFR Part 200, which is your uniform administrative requirements. And then they're in a couple other little places. There's very few things when it gets to NAHASDA that comes out of those that doesn't come from those basic 3 books. When we get to Indian preference, that would be one of them, and environmental reviews would be another one. But things don't usually vary too much from those 3 books. So Section 7 of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, it is one of those areas. So in Indian country procurement, the procurement of supplies and services is perhaps one of the most important financial and legal functions performed by you as a recipient. The responsibilities, the accountability for your housing administration, your administrators, and your procurement personnel are very, very stringent, and they apply to all of the purchases that you make on behalf of your agency, large or small. One of the primary functions of procurement is to establish a clear, detailed record for each procurement activity that demonstrates the highest quality product or service that was proved that you obtained it for the least cost that you could while providing fair access to competition for people and your potential competitors. So your procurement environment, because the awarding of contracts by the public sector actually involves the use of funds collected from the public, there's a higher standard applied to procurement documentation than if it was a private industry. So while private sector firms are generally entitled to keep information related to their purchasing private, we're not. The same is not true. Once a contract is awarded, the procurement information has to be considered actual public record to the extent that it's provided for, and you followed all your applicable federal, state, local, and tribal laws. Can you guys mute your microphones for me? Thank you. Recipients are responsible for spending public funds in the public interest and should act in accordance within that responsibility. So our language and terms. This is what you call a procurement clause, and we will get into definitely this later on, a couple of days down the road. But the majority of our purchasing follows this clause. Micro purchasing, small purchasing, sealed bids, competitive proposals, sole sourcing. You have to have general standards, documented policies, how you're going to procure the goods, what's necessary, what's full and open competition, what's conflict of interest. Conflict of interest comes into play not only admissions, but it comes into play in the administration of your contracts. Documentation, how are you keeping it? How long are you keeping it? Where is it kept at? How you perform a cost and a price analysis, and how do you go about selecting your vendors? So your procurement and your contracting, it's got its own basic language, debarment, termination for convenience, bids, quotes, liquidated damages. There's glossaries that are pages long that talk about what's an RFP, a request for proposal, what's considered a responsive contractor, what is a sealed bid, what's a schedule of values. So that glossary, you have to pretty much familiarize yourself with that also. A clarification of terms. So a recipient is always your tribal entity or whoever is administrating your housing program, your NAHASDA funds, your housing entity, your housing department, it could be called several different things, but it's whoever's taking that money and who's spending it. You're a contractor, any goods and or service provider, vendor, supplier, a builder, they're all can be referred to as a contractor. Your board could vary depending on where you're at. Your board could be your board of commissioners, could be your tribal council. It varies. Some people work under both, but they are responsible for everything you do also. Your contractor, an individual, company, or organization that provides goods or services, performs work under a contract. A contracting officer, who you as an owner have designated, who is your representative, basically, who makes the determination on contracting issues. Now, normally, that's your executive director. Depending on the size of you, if you're fortunate enough to be large, you've got your own procurement office. You've got 3 or 4, people, sometimes more. That makes it a lot easier for you. The smaller you are, the more falls on the shoulders of that AD. And sometimes you farm that position out if you don't have the experience. So advertisement, public invitation, formal announcements that you place in a newspaper, soliciting bids or proposals, negotiation, to bargain or trade regarding purchases. Bids, offers from a contractor to perform or deliver specified work or goods. Proposals, which would be an offer from a contractor. RFP, like I said before, is your request for proposal seeking goods or services. An RFQ is a little bit different. That's a request for qualifications. It's a pre-bid, often used when procuring an architect or engineering services. An IFB or an RFQ, which would be like an invitation for bid, and a request for quotes are often used, those two interchangeably, with an IFB actually being more binding. But for everything that you do, there's a certain way under procurement that you're supposed to do it. So benefits of a proper procurement: cost efficiency, reduce risk, consistency, avoid outside interference, promote competition, and compliance. Procurement is also one of the areas I work a lot preparing people for, like, HUD monitoring and audits. And sometimes I work with housing agencies after they went through their HUD monitoring process, and I try to help them answer their monitoring findings. Procurement pretty much is always on the list. Because it's one of the hardest things that we, as an Indian organization, a housing organization, do. It's very, very, you have to make sure that you take all of the necessary steps and that you document them, because you can fall for as easy as, saying that you procured something with no proof that it was, procured, or it's not in the file, or you can't see the bid list. I mean, you got a lot of steps that you have to take, and then you have to make sure that you file and you can prove that you took those steps. The common monitoring findings are that you didn't use a fair and open competition when you award a professional service contract, or you don't have a method in place for applying Indian preference. Inadequate or no procurement policy or procedures. Actual practices are inconsistent with your adopted procurement policy. So your procurement policy says you're going to do one thing and you do it a totally different way. You got to make a match. Records not maintained, no documentation, lack of a cost or a price analysis. There's times when you have to have the proof that you did that. Small purchases are not in accordance with the regulations. Conflicts of interest and or no policy. You have to have a conflict of interest policy in there. Professional services, attorneys, accountants, etc., not procured properly. You see a lot of times that once you get a good auditor, a lot of housing authorities like to use that auditor for numerous years. Well, you still have to go through the procurement process to bring them back. So you just can't keep extending and extending a contract. So goals for procurement activities: to obtain the highest quality you can for a reasonable price. Comply with your requirements to maintain documentation for everything you do there, to facilitate delivery, to understand that process, and to implement a planning process in advance. Good procurement takes a lot of planning. You should be doing it in conjunction with your Indian housing plan, depending on what you're going to, do for the following year. So basic steps for all procurement methods: you have to establish your parameters, your quality or your quantity, how much I'm going to buy, what kind of price I think it's going to cost me, the scope of work. You're supposed to do a cost or a price analysis, unless it's a micro or a small purchase. You're supposed to solicit bids, proposals, price quotes. Receive the bids, proposals, or price quotes. You evaluate them, and you award it. You enter into a contract or a purchase agreement. So the reasons for your procurement policy, this is one of the situations. Okay, what do I find about this? you'd go into 24 CFR, which I told you was the one of these two books, the statute and 24 CFR, and look under 1026, and it'll talk about your procurement policy. Now, if you want to learn again about your procurement policy, in this one, you would go to 318. That's why it's so important to get to know how to use these books properly, how to be able to read the law. One of the things about the way that the statute and the regulations were written is they don't usually duplicate each other. You'll find different bits of information in all three different places, and you almost have to put that puzzle together to get a complete picture. To ensure consistency in procurement, establish your own procurement rules and practices that don't conflict with 2 CFR 318. To assemble and integrate requirements imposed by others with your own requirements. So your procurement policy. What are the administrative requirements under NAHASDA? So except as addressed in 1028, recipients shall comply with the requirements and the standards of 2 CFR Part 2003 and audit requirements for federal awards. For purposes of this part, a grantee and non-federal entity as defined within Part 200 has the same meaning as a recipient. So 200-318 states that grantees must have their own procurement procedures. Therefore, it's imperative that the governing body establish and formally adopt a procurement policy to implement and supplement the requirements found under 2 CFR 200. The parts that you're looking at for compliance there are found through 317 through 326. So depending upon the organization, your executive director, your tribal administrator, your general manager, whoever holds that role is generally designated to administer that procurement process and policy, and perhaps is authorized to serve as your contracting officer or delegate the responsibility for certain functions and positions or individuals based within your organization. So your requirements, requirements accompanying NAHASDA funding says you have to have procurement in your policies within tribal law, other federal and sometimes state law. The procurement requirements will sometimes apply to you and other agencies or lenders funding your program. So if you were building a tax credit project in in conjunction with NAHASDA funds, your procurement rules might be different for each project. You generally go by the strictest set is the rule of thumb there. And we have uniqueness when it comes to tribal procurement. It reflects the fundamentals of our government procurement and the impact of other tribal and geographic factors. We have special circumstances where we're at, tribal laws, tribal political structures, the location, the economic conditions. You see the foot of snow. I mean, we had snow falling, and we normally do, at Halloween. We don't have the building season that I would have if I was in Arizona or Florida. So you have to plan that bidding and things like that during your winter months so you can hit the ground running when the frost laws come out. I'm a half hour to 45 minutes from groceries. I'm over 3 hours to something like a Home Depot. So, it wouldn't be the same as if I was sitting in Oklahoma and I could go 15 miles this way or 5 miles that way. And we don't have the resources. Not all tribes are laid out like that. So our location and our economic conditions, they play a huge part of the procurement process. Tribal requirements. We have to follow the tribal laws, our federally directed Indian preference, tribal licensing, tribal employment rights organizations such as TARO. This is when we signed the Hearth Act. I was fortunate enough to be present when that was done because I worked a lot on that. Other special legal issues, sovereign immunity and waivers, trust land status, tribal courts, federal rules, environmental reviews, things like that. We have a few more special ones in there, as the res turns, tribal politics, self-employment, tribal-owned companies. An organizational conflict of interest might apply. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, you'd go to 318.2. Just because somebody is Native does not mean that you have to hire them. It becomes an argument in some places when you, 28 years. I had one electrician that was, from our reservation that used to go every year in front of, not every year, we had a 2-year term for our tribal council, which is way too short, but she won't give me a job, Well, I had to, keep that documentation. It's because he wasn't timely. He didn't have the capacity to do the type of work we needed when building multiple units, and he would end up delaying all my tradespeople. And it costs money when that happens. So, you try them once, you try them again, and it happens again to you. You don't try them the third time. It's just not allowable. You can't make mistakes when you know better going in, but you have to document it. So every time a brand new tribal council would come in, I'd have to lay it out and explain it to them, but just keep your documentation. You don't always have to hire the people from your reservation if they do not give you the best product. If they do, by all means, try to get them as much work as you can. Other circumstances impacting procurement: isolated communities, limited suppliers and contractors and workforce, harsh climates, like I said. We got late in one year and we were actually pouring slabs under heated tents, just so we could work on them, through the rest of the winter. Like I talked about the communities, limited suppliers. I put something out for bid one time because we didn't have a meth problem up here. Had suspect, that there was meth used. To even get the testing up here, I had to put it out for bid 3 times. It was, 4 hours away, somebody that would answer us in the Lower Peninsula. And then I ended up sole sourcing it with HUD permission because nobody else wanted to come up here for, testing and eradication of one unit. It just wasn't worth their time. So nobody would answer. So I'd have to keep, putting it out for bids. So, I'll teach you about that later on, how to do things like that. So federal standard versus tribal standards. Recipients are required to follow applicable state, local, tribal laws on procurement. And in some cases, federal standards are stricter than the state or the local or the tribal law. In such cases, the recipient has to comply with the applicable federal law and 2 CFR 200, subpart D. That's why it's important that you read and you know what's in that book. For example, if tribal law is silent on the issue of bonds for construction contracts, the requirements of the federal regulations apply. If state, local, or tribal law is stricter than the federal standards, then state, local, or tribal law apply. You need to use caution when you're writing your procurement policy. If your threshold is lower than the federal standard, you're going to be held to your adopted tribal procurement amount. So the last time they raised like the simple acquisition threshold, if you didn't redo your policy since then, you're using a smaller amount than it's allowed by federal law. And then oh, wow, it says I can go up to this amount. Well, no, you have to go by what is in your procurement policy. So when they do things like that, it's time you have somebody look at your procurement policy. And if nothing else, just change that portion of it. Make sure that you get it adopted. There is nothing worse than have an audit or a HUD monitoring thing and not be able to pull out your policies. Know where they are. Make sure you have the most current policy, and make sure you have proof that it was adopted. It'll save you a lot of grief. So that would be make sure your procurement policy is up to date. Your fundamentals of procurement: fair and competitive process, reasonable and low price, from what they call a responsible and responsive bidder. They have to be both, or contractor or vendor. And you have to have an open and a public process to do that. So your incentives for government procurement to reduce cost, your taxpayer money, you award it on the merit of the people bidding or trying to procure. And it avoids corruption and scandals and them, um, the appearance of a conflict of interest. There's public policy initiatives, Indian other preferences. You have to follow your wage rates. You have to follow labor standards and your environmental protection. Make sure that part is done. Government procurement principles to remember. Ours are different from procurement in the private sector. You can't negotiate purchases or contracts except on an RFP in a limited situation. It's governed by laws and regulations, federal laws, NAHASDA, tribal laws. You've got laws coming from every direction. Special requirements imposed by your government funding sources. Your written procurement rules, your policies, and your procedures are needed to list your requirements, to educate and explain, and to have a uniform application. If Jesse's in your procurement office doing it this way because of the procurement thing, and he leaves, or he now has somebody else doing the same type of job, well, John needs to do it the same way. You should have a uniform application and the same method and procedures for doing things. So there's also sometimes different sources of procurement regulations and requirements. If you've got a bank loan involved, if it's a low-income housing tax credit, if it's a state housing finance agency, or using their funds, USDA, rural development. If you don't work with USDA, guys, try to. There's a lot of money out there for Indian country through them. Ted Bulow is just fantastic. Bond projects. He's the Indian liaison, by the way. You also have to reconcile differing regulations and requirements. That they can conflict. You got to find a way to comply with both, or give up one of your funding sources, or, like I said, follow the strictest rules. Procurement methods and requirements. You can look at there's a sample procurement policy within that appendix. If you send a procurement policy to HUD and they don't have time to look at it or whatever, oftentimes they'll say, here's a sample, use this one. And it's the same, you can see it, it's been updated, but it's the one that's in there. Adherence to procurement rules. Limit and discourage exceptions. Ensure consistent application of your rules. Ensure your compliance with your laws and funding requirements. And to make sure that you do efficient self-monitoring, because you have to check your procurement when you do your self-monitoring before your APR. Where do you incorporate NAHASDA? You add procurement requirements to your recipient's procurement policy. Add applicable contracting requirements to your recipient contracts. Just make sure you follow NAHASDA. So your regulations, principal regulations, there's a list of administrative requirements under NAHASDA, including selected sections of 2 CFR Part 200 that apply, and exemption provisions for self-governance tribes. But you would go under 24 CFR 1026. Remember what I said about those numbers? If you aren't using or know how to read these things, that's what I hope, if nothing, you come out of this with, is an idea how to use those 3 books, because they will help you for your rest of your career in housing. 2 CFR Part 200, your administrative requirements has the cost principles. Your audit requirements for federal awards, those are found in section 317 to 326, and they deal specifically with procurement. So your 1026 actually requires that recipients comply with the requirements of another book. They send you back over to Part 200. The primary procurement regulations applicable to all recipients. It's regardless of size. You can be a housing authority of 3 or a housing authority of 300. They're found under 2 CFR through 317 through 326. So you become very, very familiar with those parts. There are exceptions. Procurement by states will not apply per CFR 1026 and through 200-317. So you would read those. There's also some other regulations and directives out there. In the 1000 categories, this is, why I said sometimes it's faster just to have the book and you can go through them this way. The 1012 deals with non-discrimination. 14 is where I would go to if I wanted to find out about relocation and real property acquisition. 16 is the labor standards. 18 is your environmental review requirements. 20 would become the tribal responsibility for that. 21 would be if you were trying to get a waiver. 22 are eligible costs having to do with an environmental review. And 24 is if you were going to ask for HUD assistance there. 26 is your administrative requirements under NAHASDA. 28 deals with your self-governance tribes. 30, 32, and 34 all deal with conflict of interest, prohibitions, exceptions, and exception factors. 38, flood insurance requirements that we're all under. 40 is your lead-based paint requirements. They'll still tag you on. You can say, well, I don't have any units, built after this, period of time. You'll still get tagged. You better put a disclaimer in there on your file saying all these units were built in 1990 or whatever, forward. And lead-based paint does not apply. But you also have to make sure that if you're giving any type of down payment assistance, tenant-based rental assistance, anything like that, well, your lead-based paint is going to kick in there too. So it's just not your units on the ground. 1042, Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. Some of you are going, Section 3 does not apply anymore. Well, we're going to hit on that a little while down the road because there's some confusion on behalf of some right now when it gets to Section 3. 1044, you're debarred, you're suspended, and you're ineligible contractors. We're going to talk about that. A lot of people get tagged on that, believe it or not. They're not checking sam.gov, not taking a screenshot or printing that piece of paper out. Certain things you got to make sure you do there. Your drug-free workplace. Do you have those statements up? Do you have a signed thing in every file saying it's a drug-free workplace and you give that to your employee? Indian and tribal preference requirements for your activities. Tribal or Indian preference requirements, your grant administration. Procurement. And do you have Indian preference complaint procedures? I think I give samples of the majority of those for you guys in there. The following selected regulations from 2 CFR 200 pertain to recipients of the block grant. Procurement by states will not apply per, and you would read under 1026 to find out about that. General procurement standards are found under 318. There is new requirements, 318C2, organizational conflicts. We're going to cover that later, but you have to have something in your policies dealing with organizational conflicts and time and material contracts. 200 also deals with competition, method of procurement to be followed. 267 is your micro purchase exclusion. NAHASDA statute, section 203 and 24 CFR 1026 apply. Contracting with small and minority businesses, women businesses, labor, surplus area firms. 322 is procurement of recovered materials. Contract cost and price are under 323. 324, federal award agency or pass-through entity review. Your bonding requirements. You go to 325 when you want to find out, okay, how much bonding has to be in place for a job of this size. And 326 deals with your contract provisions. So your uniform guidance, that Code of Federal Regulations 2 CFR 200, what is it? It's basically referred now as the Uniform Guidance for Federal Awards, Part 200. It replaced, it consolidated, it streamlined 8 different federal regulations into that one book, that one guide. It applies to all federal grants. So that's something that your procurement policy could actually be used by the tribe. And certain other type of federal awards to ensure the accountability of all that federal funding. Basically, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, they establish those uniform administrative requirements, those cost principles, those audit requirements, and the regulations implementing 24 CFR 1000. They include a variety of general administrative requirements that have to be followed by us as recipients of Indian block grant funds. So prior to 2014, the regulations, NAHASDA regulations addressing those were cited in those other places. They were codified under, but so now they're all streamlined. Those 8 are no more, and they're all found in one place. It's aimed at eliminating duplicative or almost duplicative language in order to clarify where policy is different across different types of entities and where it's not. So they issued that final rule in December 26th, right at the end of the year 2013, and it became effective a full year later. So it took a little while. So then and now, these are basically all of the things that got thrown into that one bucket. Your A133, your A87, your A85. So it's all in there now. When you grab this book, it's broken to subparts. Subpart A deals with your acronyms and your definitions. B deals with your general provisions. C is your pre-federal award requirements and your formula allocation. So that deals with that in there also. D, somebody's got an open mic. D is your post-federal award requirements. E is your cost principles, and F deals with your audit requirements. So all ONAP program grant agreements state that the award is subject to regulations as they may be, amended, and you apply the Part 200 to current and prior year grants. There is a subpart B. It provides the basis for the systematic and periodic collection of uniform submission. It prescribes the manner in which GSA and OMB and all of our federal agencies will administer those programs. It requires that you have, and you find the guidance under 200-112, conflict of interest policies. The federal awarding agency has to establish a conflict of interest policy for federal awards. So you have to have that within your group of policies. The non-federal entity must disclose in writing any potential conflict of interest to the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity in accordance with your agency policy. So you not only have to have that policy in place, but should you have a perceived or an apparent conflict of interest, you have to notify HUD of that. 200-113 talks about mandatory disclosures. You must disclose in a timely manner in writing to your federal awarding agency any violation of federal criminal law involving fraud, bribery, gratuity violations that could affect that award. So should one of your board of commissioners or tribal council or staff members be charged with anything, you have to notify HUD of that. You are required to report certain civil, criminal, and administrative proceedings to SAM. So there's an exception found within 1026 and 200 .113 applies, except that in lieu of remedies described within 20338, HUD shall be authorized to seek remedies under subpart F. So actually they could do the fining, the prosecuting, the payback agreement, the holding all your money, but they could actually set forth a penalty, I guess we'll say. So in accordance with the federal grants and cooperative agreements, the federal award agencies has to identify appropriate instruments for use for your non-federal entity. For NAHASDA, HUD uses a grant agreement, basically to award that IHBG to your tribe or your TDHE. Suspension and debarment, non-federal entities are subject to non-procurement debarment and suspension regulations, implementing executive orders 12549 and 12689 and 2 CFR Part 180. Those regulations restrict awards, subawards, contracts with certain parties that are debarred, suspended, or otherwise excluded from ineligible participation in any type of federal assistance programs or activities. That's why they want you checking with sam.gov and for every procurement basically, and showing proof, because they do not want federal funds, which your money is, being spent on somebody that's suspended or debarred. So under 200's procurement, it's split up. 317 talks to states. 18 is your procurement standards. 319 is where you would go to find out about competition. 320 is your methods of procurement that you should be following. 321 talks about contracting with small minority firms, women businesses. 323 is your contract cost and price. 324 is awarding agency review. 325 again is your bonding, provides acceptable methods when there's inconsistencies. And 326 talks about your contract provisions. So you're responsible for complying with all the requirements of your federal award. They include financial management, investment, cash management, accounting systems, internal controls, equipment, property, inventory, your control and your disposition. That's actually deals with your procurement. Your retention requirement for your records, a minimum of 3 years pretty much on everything across the board. A lot longer for certain documents. The federal or your financial management system for each non-federal entity must provide for a request for a transfer of records, methods for collection and storage of your information. How are you protecting that information within your agency? Access to records. Who are you going to allow to see that information? And restrictions on public access to certain records. So your non-federal entity has to use its own documented procurement procedures, which reflect, state, local, tribal law. Your non-federal entity must maintain oversight to ensure that your contractors perform in accordance with terms, conditions, specifications of the contracts that you set out or your purchase orders. Your non-federal entity must maintain written standards of conduct, basically covering conflicts of interest, governing the actions of any employee or board member engaged in the selection, award, and the administration of contracts. No employee, officer, or agent can participate in that selection if they have a real or apparent conflict of interest. Such conflict of interest would arise when that employee or that officer or agent, any member of their immediate family even, or your partner, don't have to be married, or an organization which employs or is about to employ any of the above mentioned, has a financial or other interest in a tangible personal benefit from a firm considered for a contract. You got to make sure that you teach your boards, your staff, recusal. You have to, not only should be recusing themselves, but there's certain times they should be stepping away and knowing nothing about a contracting activity if it could be perceived that there's a conflict there, that they're too close, that someone in their family could be bidding on it. The standards of conduct that you have in place for your housing entity has to provide for disciplinary actions to be applied when there's a violation for such standards by your officers, employees, or agencies of that, and those actions actually have to be written within the policy. What are you going to do? How are you going to punish them? So make sure you have that policy in place. I don't know if there's a guideline in there. I think I've got some language showing you later on in the week on that.
Cheryl?
So training and guidance. Pardon
Sorry,
me?
there's a question on what you were just discussing from Deborah. She's inquiring if you have a sample policy for these requirements, and she's also asking if they are all required within the procurement policy.
The conflict of interest, yes, are required. It's not within the procurement policy. Those are conflict of interest policies that every tribe has to have. You have two sets of conflict of interest policies that every tribe should have. One that is the administration and the placement of your housing applicants, and then the other one is for contracting and administration. I believe that there is samples in there. If not, when I hit that on whichever day, you're going to see a sample right up on the board.
Perfect.
And if
Thank
that's
you.
not enough, I get her email and I can send them to her if that doesn't prove enough. So, okay. So training and guidance on 2 CFR Part 200. It's available now. Your EWONAP does training on it. NLC does training on it. NIC does training on it. You can always ask for training and technical assistance through your HUD office. And there's actually guidance sessions. They did a 9-part series on Part 200. It's YouTube videos. They're really good. And they're very small clips. I think they're like 12 minutes each. So you don't have to do the whole thing at once. You have to remember when you're reading uniform guidance, they should and must, on those definitions. Do that. There we go. Okay. They're very precise in using those terms. Should and must. Should means it's a best practice. When it comes to CFR Part 200, must means that it's required. But I would recommend this, going through that link or watching some of those YouTube videos if you're not too familiar with that document. So some of the highlights, the simple acquisition threshold was increased to 250,000, which allows for purchases below that amount using small purchase methods. The micro purchase amount for procurement was increased to 10,000. Now this all took place in August 13th of 2020. So that would be a good marker in your head to look at your procurement policy. And if it was put in place and has not been amended before this date, there's places where you can give yourself more leeway. You can change and adopt to hit these different thresholds. Domestic preferences for procurement doesn't really have a lot to do with us, but these are the highlights of that one particular document. Equipment means tangible property having a useful life of more than 1 year and a per unit acquisition cost of more than 5,000. Audit requirements increased to 750,000 for a single audit. So that document is a pretty good one for the changes. Now, the ONAP exceptions, program statutes or existing regulations preempt 2 CFR Part 200. The preemptions are reflected in our program regulations. So conforming regulations are necessary, conflict of interest and mandatory disclosures. and to apply ONAP's existing exceptions, for example, NAHASDA's definitions of program income. We'll always go by that statute. So procurement authority and administration of the procurement function. The IHAs are required to establish and follow a written procurement policy. It needs not contain detailed working level procedures, but should require establishment of such procedures to carry out that policy. Some IHAs prefer to combine the policy and or procedures into a single publication for the convenience of staff. Make sure your policy is reviewed, updated, and always keep proof of adoption by your board. This goes to every policy that you have within your housing entity. If you adopt a policy, make a photocopy of it, staple it to the back page, whatever you do, but you have to show where it was adopted by your board. Staffing and training. Your housing entity should ensure that your procurement employees have training and experience commensurate with the requirements of their duties. Your housing entity should develop a training and experience standards for your procurement positions. Periodically review your operations to ensure that procurement personnel meet those standards. You should consider any changes in procurement environment, new laws, regulations, market conditions, buying needs, practices of the IHA when assessing the qualifications and the personnel and the needs for additional training. I cannot imagine being a procurement officer in the last 2 years with what the market has done for like the market price on materials. I mean, you could have went out and had, quotes and estimates on things, and the prices tripled during some, and some of it's coming back down, but there's still parts you can't get. I mean, my car, I think I had to order 5 months out. My couch, I had to order 3-4 months out, there's still lots of things with chips that you cannot get. You guys are in a really, really difficult place. And I hope your leadership recognizes how hard procurement has been within the last 2 years. You guys, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. Let's put it that way. Make sure that, you assess the qualifications and the personnel. Make sure you get them training if they need it. Delegation of authority. So generally your procurement policy delegates responsibility for procurement functions to your executive director, depending upon the size. And if it's a new executive director, you might have a procurement officer who's been there 15 years and a director that's been there 3 months. Hopefully the board will delegate that to your existing procurement staff. The executive director has authority to assign all or a portion of that responsibility to positions or individuals based in the organization and staffing of your housing entity. So a person with authority for procurement activities is usually referred to as the contracting officer. When he or she performs that function, regardless of any other job or position title that they might have, your entity shall establish policies for the delegations of procurement authority, either to the executive director. Those policies should be included in your written procurement policy. Delegations of that procurement authority should clearly state the limits of the authority delegated in terms of dollar value or individual obligations that person can make, and any other limits, types of contracts that the individual could award, such as small purchases. Delegation should also state whether the recipient can further redelegate. Can you say, okay, Sally is my contracting officer. Joe is the assistant contracting officer, and he can procure up to this amount and this type of contract. But Mike is allowed to do anything via purchase order, you should delineate exactly how much and what type within your stuff. Delegation should state whether the recipient can further redelegate, like I said, that Mike's allowed to do this. And if you're going to do that, how much Mike's allowed to do. So the responsibility of your contracting officer Regardless of the authority delegated, it's the responsibility of your contracting officer to use sound judgment in accomplishing the procurement activities of your housing entity. To ensure that bidders and contractors, they receive fair, impartial, and equitable treatment. To ensure contract actions comply with all applicable federal, state, tribal laws, with and using your IHA's approved procurement policy. That they seek the best value, the greatest overall benefit for your IHA in response to basically the needs desired. They're supposed to request and consider the advice of specialists as appropriate. If you don't know what you're doing, go hire an engineer, hire an architect, get that help. It'll save you in the long run and you'll get a better product. Depending on what you're procuring, don't wing it if you have no clue. Procurement, you'll get tagged on it, and you'll do yourself a disservice. Develop and issue solicitations for supplies, services, construction. You analyze bids and proposals. You conduct negotiations as appropriate. Signing all contracts, modifications, purchasing agreements, purchase orders, other purchase documents. Another responsibility, the CO is basically monitoring the performance of the procurement staff, issuing final decisions in the case of dispute. That's where the grievance goes there. Terminate contracts if you have to, if it's appropriate. Initiate and complete administrative actions, and can delegate some responsibility to a chosen representative. When I was an executive director, I ended up sending one of my staff. We used our community college quite a bit for building. They would build for us using their building trades. We'd supply, the materials. They supply free labor, but they had a 4-year course. I paid for one of my staff to go through that 4-year course, give him the time off. He was tribal, so there was no cost there. Under the agreement that he would serve 2 years minimum as my contracting officer. He was actually not my contracting officer. He was my inspector. He was my building inspector. But you can do things like that. Farm them out, give them the tools, get them the teaching. Just make sure that they stay with you to pay off that time and effort for a little while. So while a separate position of a COR is not mandatory, the following are some of the general and broad responsibilities that a contracting officer's representative would assume if you designate from your contracting officer. They can define work requirements, prepare cost analysis, prepare your invitation for bids, prepare requests for proposals, assist in the pre-award phase, act as your technical representative. On behalf of the contracting officer, direct work of contracts. They can't modify the contracts themselves. Provide ongoing coordination and technical assistance for your contracting officer. So this is what a contracting officer's representative, some of their job duties could be: to inspect, evaluate, accept your contractor's work, to establish a system for conducting progress and final inspections, advise your contracting officer when situations arise that could actually modify or disrupt or hinder any performance, document, file on all transactions, including phone calls, monitor and track payments, and assist with contract closeout. What you should not have them do is issue any type of contract change. That should still be in the realm of your contracting officer. Deviate from any term of a contract. Manage basically a contractor's efforts. Supervise or otherwise control contractors' employees. That's not your job to be supervising any of them. Perform any other function that would violate provisions of any contract. So what is the contracting officer's signature, and what is their obligation of funds? So each contract or purchase action that you take place, a new contract, a modification, an interagency agreement, purchase order, that obligates your housing entity to pay a contractor or a vendor has to be signed or otherwise authorized by an individual to whom your housing agency has expressly delegated the authority to make that obligation on behalf of your housing entity. The signature of that contracting officer on any type of contract is a legal commitment. It requires continuing performance by your housing entity under the terms and conditions of that contract. Performance includes duties as monitoring those contract performances, acceptance or rejection of contractor request, changes in performance specifications or price. Davis-Bacon, somebody's got to go out and do that part. If an individual is not an authorized contracting officer, that individual must not bind your housing entity by making an implied contract, such as by making a promise or stating an intent to purchase, either orally or in writing, when, they're doing bids over the phone. Under the laws of agency and apparent authority, your housing entity they could be liable for that, bound by the acts of any of your employees. So you have to be really, really careful. If such person who is not a contracting officer appears to be an officer or to be given that authority by your housing entity, it could be misinterpreted as committing your housing agency to purchase. It's got to be clarified with a statement such as, this request for price quotation is not an offer to buy and should not be assumed as such. That could be, the ending tagline every time you get a phone quotation. Just make sure that, they know that they don't have the right to enter into a contract on behalf of your housing entity. So we're done for the day, guys. Does anybody have any questions? We're gonna be in the same place, same time tomorrow. If I can't answer any of your questions, if there's something that I don't know the answer to, because there's been times where I've had to, call a HUD office and then I'll get 3 answers there, and finally, I'll definitely get back to you with an answer if I can't answer it. So I don't know. Do you guys have any questions? And if not, I'll see you tomorrow. And thank you for your commitment and service to all of our people.
I have a question.
Okay.
This
I'm
is
trying
Deborah. You know it would be me, Cheryl.
Hi, Deborah. There you
Hi.
are.
Yes, so you kind of know my situation. I've known about procurement for quite a while, but I've never really been the procurement officer. But I'm tasked with developing these policies. I've already done a conflict of interest policy for my nonprofit, and next is the procurement policy. And so timing is wonderful. I'm just wondering, so all the requirements that you listed, about the time when I started asking questions on the PowerPoint, about all the requirements. So when I used to work for YNHA, I think they had like 29 different policies to address the different requirements. So being a non-small profit, do you suggest that I try to consolidate some of those policies with anticipation? Right now, I do have a couple of subrecipient agreements with HUD funds. So my question is, do you think I should have separate policies to meet all these different requirements, such as records retention, all that list of requirements? I wish we had that page to look at them again, but that's my question.
Well, your key phrase there was HUD funds.
Uh-huh.
If they're HUD funds, they're required pretty much.
Yeah.
So whether you adopt your own or use your others as a template,
Uh-huh.
You're going to need them either way.
Yeah.
So it's up to you. I was going to, Yakima policies might be a lot more than you're going to need right now.
Mm-hmm.
So you might want to pare them down. But definitely use the procurement policy example.
Okay.
That's definitely one that you could use. because
does-
that's pretty much a minimum there.
Okay, and does it have all those requirements in it that you listed on the PowerPoint?
Probably not all of them, no.
Probably not all of them?
No,
Okay.
but we can get them, and you can, if you can't, you can always apply for somebody to come and help you write your policy.
Yeah. I have two technologists, two consultants right now helping me.
Yep. Yep.
So,
but there should be a list, and if not, I can send you a list of all the policies that are pretty much required for a housing entity.
okay. If you want to send me that, that'd be great. I don't want to miss anything. I've seen your list in the PowerPoint, but I don't want to miss anything. This is my first rodeo developing policies from the ground, from the scratch. Because I've always had policies in place at the housing authority. When I got there, they were already adopted. Maybe we updated them or something because I say, hey, we need to update these, or these aren't working anymore. But I've never did it from scratch.
Well, good luck. Crystal, they can get a copy of the PowerPoint if they need it, right? There she is. You're muted. She's laughing and muted. You're still muted.
Okay, well, she looks like Crystal's stuck on mute, but anyway, I really appreciate that, Cheryl and Crystal.
No worries. We'll get you. We got a whole week to get you.
Yay! Okay. Thank you so much.
Anybody have anything else? And if not, we're on tomorrow. I can't see the chat box, unfortunately. Crystal, are we good to go then? Thank you, everybody. I saw Gina.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day. I hope you got something out of today's anyway. Yes, same time tomorrow. Ah, her computer froze. Bye, guys. Oh, look at that beautiful picture. Adrian Compton, I'm jealous. Okay.
Sorry, my laptop froze.
That's all right, my girl.
All right, yeah, everything should be good to go. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to throw them.
The PowerPoint will have everything from today's class?
Yes, and you can find all of today's information on that web link that I threw into the chat. That has everything, all of the appendix items, all 5 days of presentations, all of it.
All right.
But do not take off on me for the next 4 days because you have PowerPoint, dude.
No, I had an emergency at work. I missed the first hour there.
Oh,
so
geez.
Really upset about that. But anyway, I'm going to look through this PowerPoint and see what I can gather from it.
Okay. And today was the easiest day, so just don't miss me the rest of the week.
You got it. Thank you.
Have a great day, guys. Stay safe.
Yes,
Bye now.
Thank you, everyone.